Psycho Karen completely snapped the moment she saw my disabled son Oliver playing outside, his long hair flowing in the breeze, free and wild. In her distorted mind, it was shameful, a disgrace for men or boys to have long hair. Driven by rage and without warning, she grabbed a pair of scissors and in broad daylight, she lunged at my son and started hacking off his hair. Oliver's scream pierced the air as he cried and begged her to stop. But Karen didn't care. Chunk by chunk, she butchered his hair. And the worst part, no one stopped her. My neighbors watched as this horror unfolded, too afraid to challenge the woman who had terrorized this neighborhood for years. And just like that, what should have been a peaceful Saturday afternoon turned into the most horrifying moment of my life. As a parent to a disabled autistic child, Karen thought she would get away with it, just like always. But this time, she messed with the wrong family, and she was about to learn there are some lines you never cross. Here's what happened. When you have a child with special needs, you learn to cherish the little things that bring them peace. For my 14-year-old son, Oliver, that peace came from something very simple. His long hair. Oliver is gentle, kind, and autistic. Loud noises overwhelm him. Unfamiliar places make him anxious. He struggles with change, with sudden shifts in routine. But over time, amidst all that uncertainty, my wife and I began to notice something. His hair. My wife and I noticed that his hair always soothed him. Our boy is like millions of other people in the world who are afraid of storms. Not just the kind that rumbles in the distance. The kind that shakes the windows, rattles the walls. Every part of the loud crashes of thunder and the unpredictable flashes of lightning sent him into panic. And every time a storm rolled in, it was the same. As soon as the first clap of thunder split through the sky, we would hear our boy scream. I would rush to his room, a wife close behind me, and there we would find him, curled into the corner of his bed, small hands clamped over his ears, his breathing ragged, his whole body trembling. My wife would kneel beside him, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. We're here." But he wouldn't hear us. He was lost in the here. Then each time, the same thing happened. Through the chaos of his panic, our boy fingers would find his hair. First, it was just a light touch. Then his hands would move through it. Slow, deliberate, focused. And just like that, his breathing would slow, the trembling would ease. His small hands would weave through the strands again and again, like a rhythm, like a routine. We always watched in stunned silence, even though the storm outside was still raging inside. That moment, Oliver had found his anchor. It wasn't the nightlight. It wasn't our whispered reassurances. It was his hair. I remember the moment my wife looked at me, her eyes wide with realization. From that night on, we never questioned it. We never cut our son Oliver's hair short. The soft strands between his fingers were his way of grounding himself in a chaotic world. When he felt anxious, he would run his fingers through it, finding comfort in the familiar, the softness, the security. It might not make sense to others, but to him, it was everything. So my wife and I let him grow his hair as long as he wanted, because it gave him peace. And we weren't the only ones who understood. Oliver's grandparents, aunts and uncles embraced it too. Not once did my father pull him aside and say, "Boys should have short hair." Not once did my brothers or my wife's brothers offer to take him for a trim or joke about giving him a cut. Instead, they supported him. My wife's mom adored my son's hair, calling it his golden crown. She would gently brush it when he let her, humming softly as she worked through the tangles. His aunties made sure it was always cared for, helping to wash and braid it when it got too unruly. They treated it with the same respect Oliver did, because they knew his hair wasn't just hair. It was his shield, his security. So you can imagine how I felt the day my son came home in tears, clutching the severed strands of his own hair. I had never felt so helpless looking at my son, his face streaked with tears, his hands gripping the soft, broken pieces of what had once been his comfort. Even as a former chief of police who had so much faith in my own gated community, that was terrifying. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. I never thought I'd be at war with my own homeowner association. 4 years, Karen, the self-appointed queen of my homeowner association, had been running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom. She had driven families out, humiliated anyone who defied her, and ruined lives with her petty vendettas. If Karen didn't like you, she found a way to make your life miserable. And the worst part, the homeowner association let her do it. Every complaint dismissed. Every accusation swept under the rug. They protected her because she was one of them. Because people like Karen never face consequences. She had bullied plenty of people before. Families had packed up and left just to escape her. Karen hated my son's hair. She despised it. Said it made him look like a girl. That it was unnatural for a boy to walk around like that. She had made comments before. Sarcastic remarks disguised as friendly advice. Boys shouldn't have messy hair. That's not how a proper young man should look. It makes the neighborhood look bad. She saw my son as an outsider, a child who didn't fit into her pristine, perfect vision of the neighborhood. But we ignored her. We had bigger battles to fight than some bitter woman's opinion. Until the day Karen took matters into her own hands. We hadn't realized it before, but Karen didn't just want to complain. She wanted control, and that's what led to everything spiraling into a nightmare. For years, Karen ruled our neighborhood like her personal domain. If you weren't wealthy enough, obedient enough, or her kind of people, she made sure you knew you weren't welcome. From what I've learned about her, Karen wasn't born powerful. She married into it. Her husband Richard was a self-made real estate tycoon, the kind of man who closed deals over steak dinners and never second-guessed himself. He had money, a lot of it, and for Karen, that was the dream. A life of country clubs, exclusive charity galas, and women who judged you based on the brand of your handbag. She had spent her entire marriage learning the rules of the elite. She realized wealth wasn't just about money, it was about dominance. And if you weren't the one controlling the room, you were the one being controlled. So Karen adapted. She clawed her way up from being just Richard's pretty wife to becoming the woman who dictated the social hierarchy and the neighborhood that was her realm. She thrived on the intoxicating power that came with being married to a man twice her age. A man whose wealth could make problems and people disappear. She knew the admiration around her was shallow, that people smiled to her face simply because of her last name. But that didn't matter. As long as she held power, she could pretend it was real. One night at an exclusive country club dinner, she tried to put that power on display. The air was thick with quiet command, filled with CEOs, high-profile investors, and old money families who had ruled our gated community for generations. Sitting beside her husband, Karen wasn't just another social climber. That night, she was one of them, or at least that's what she wanted to believe. At her table, she spoke with an air of certainty, picking apart a neighbor whose home, in her opinion, no longer fit the aesthetic. She didn't just gossip, she issued verdicts, confident that her words had weight, because in Karen's mind, power wasn't just about influence, it was about deciding who belonged and who didn't. She had offhandedly mentioned that the woman needed to go. Her husband Richard had barely looked up from his steak. "I'll handle it." 3 weeks later, the woman was gone. No foreclosure notice, no warning, just gone. Karen had asked Richard what happened. He had smirked, cutting into his meal like he hadn't just rearranged someone's life with a single phone call. Does it matter? And in that moment, Karen realized something. Money didn't just buy things. It erased people. It rewrote reality. And once she tasted that kind of power, she could never go back. At first, Karen had played the role she was expected to. The smiling, graceful wife at charity gala. The perfect hostess for high society dinners. The woman who stood beside her husband, nodding politely while men made all the decisions. But behind the scenes, she was learning, watching how power moved, seeing who bowed and who needed to be crushed, understanding that fear was stronger than loyalty. Karen didn't just want status. She wanted control, so she carved out her own territory. And the homeowner association, that was her realm. She didn't just sit on the board, she controlled it. She decided who stayed and who left. She dictated what was acceptable and what wasn't. She made people fear her because fear meant power, because fear was the only kind of loyalty she could truly control. And Karen was addicted to control. It was 3 years ago when a new family moved in. The Martins. They weren't Karen's kind of people. They weren't refined. They weren't proper. And worst of all, they weren't obedient. Karen had invited them over for drinks, her usual tactic for figuring out if someone was worth keeping around the moment they walked. And she knew their handshakes were too casual, they laughed too loudly, they weren't wearing anything designer, and when she subtly suggested that they repaint their front door a more fitting shade, they smiled politely and ignored her. That was the moment she decided they wouldn't last. Within a year, they were gone. Karen had made sure of it. Samantha Ruiz was a bright, talented high school student who lived 3 houses down from Karen. Her parents were first-generation homeowners, hardworking people who saved for years to give their daughter a better life. But Karen, she saw them as outsiders. She hated how smart Samantha was, how hard her family worked, how they didn't bow to her ridiculous rules. So she set out to destroy them. First she complained about Samantha's car. That old thing is an eyesore. You need to park it somewhere else. This isn't a junkyard. Then she went after Samantha herself. One day, Karen saw Samantha in her front yard helping her dad paint their fence. The next day, an anonymous complaint landed at Samantha's high school principal's office. Karen had fabricated a story that Samantha was skipping school and vandalizing property. The school launched an investigation. For weeks, Samantha's future hung in the balance. It took security footage, witness statements, and a relentless fight from her parents to clear her name. And Karen? She just shrugged it off, smiling, sipping wine on her porch. The homeowner association refused to acknowledge what she had done. There's no proof Karen was involved, they said. But everyone knew the truth. Another family Karen targeted was the Carters. The Carters had opened their home to foster children. Their house was full of life. Kids laughing, playing, experiencing love and stability for the first time. Karen hated it. This isn't a daycare. You can't just bring in random kids. This is a respectable neighborhood. Then the complaints started. Noise violations for kids laughing in the backyard. Parking complaints because their case workers occasionally parked in the driveway. Homeowner association concerns about how safe the neighborhood was with so many kids coming and going. Karen even spread rumors that the Carters were running an illegal operation, that their home wasn't suitable for children. They fought back, but the homeowner association, they sided with Karen. After months of harassment, legal threats, and fines, the Carters moved. Karen stood on her porch watching as the moving truck pulled away, sipping her signature glass of wine. Another family gone. So when someone in the neighborhood didn't fit her vision of perfection, it wasn't just about property values. It was about Karen proving she was still in control. If she could make people bend to her will, it meant she still mattered. That's why she crushed anyone who defied her. That's why she destroyed families, ruined reputations, and manipulated the homeowner association board. Because if she ever lost power, she feared she would lose everything. And the worst part, the homeowner association let her do it. Complaints dismissed, evidence destroyed, victims silenced. No one dared to challenge her, not unless they wanted their lives turned upside down. These things had all happened before I moved into this gated community. And hearing these stories about Karen terrorizing this neighborhood made my stomach twist with unease. I had seen it in people's faces when she walked past. The way they stiffened, the way their smiles turned forced, the way they bent over backward to stay in her good graces. I had shaken my head at it, all at her petty rules, at her cutting remarks disguised as concern, at her relentless need to control everything and everyone around her. But I was former chief of police. I dealt with real criminals, real threats. What was Karen compared to that? A nuisance. An arrogant, power-drunk woman who enjoyed making people miserable. Or at least that's what I used to think. Until I learned too late that Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a predator. And now she had her sights set on my son. Karen had always hated Oliver's hair. She made sure we knew it. The sneering comments, the passive-aggressive remarks at homeowner association meetings. The way she would stare at him one afternoon during an homeowner association meeting. I sat quietly as Karen smirked and tapped her manicured nails against the table, her eyes scanning the room, and then, as if the thought had just struck her, she sighed dramatically. You know, I think it's time we start implementing some appearance guidelines for the neighborhood, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I barely glanced up from the notes I was taking until I felt her eyes land on me. We want our community to be presentable, professional, a place where standards are upheld. A few people nodded hesitantly. No one wanted to argue with her. She turned her gaze toward me, then casually added, and that includes children. I mean, we wouldn't want the wrong image, would we? My grip on my pen tightened. She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew exactly who she was talking about. Oliver. Other times, it was more direct. Like the time she stopped my wife and me while we were out for a walk. Oliver a few steps ahead, lost in his own world. Karen's eyes flickered toward him, her nose wrinkling as if she had just smelled something rotten. You know, I'm just saying this as a friend, she began, the lie already thick in her voice, but don't you think it's time to give that boy a proper haircut? My wife, always patient, smiled politely. Oliver likes his hair long. Karen laughed, a short, sharp sound. He'll grow out of it. Then with a fake sigh of pity, she added, kids can be so cruel. You wouldn't want him to get bullied, would you? The unspoken words hung heavy in the air because we both knew the truth. Karen didn't really care about Oliver getting bullied. Karen wanted him to feel like he didn't belong. Then came what, looking back, turned out to be the final warning. Before Karen finally snapped, Oliver was outside, sitting on the low stone wall near our driveway, his legs swinging gently as he absent-mindedly wove his fingers through his hair. I was just a few feet away, sitting back in my chair, a book in my hands, but barely reading, just enjoying the quiet, the kind of peaceful afternoon that felt rare these days. Oliver wasn't doing anything unusual, just being himself. Just existing. That was enough to set her off. Karen had been walking her perfectly groomed poodle latte in hand, the picture of effortless authority. She stopped just a few feet from Oliver, her shadow looming over him. Still holding on to all that hair, huh? She mused, her voice carrying that usual tone, mocking, taunting, dripping with disapproval. Oliver didn't answer, didn't even look at her, just kept running his fingers through the soft strands the way he always did when he needed to feel safe. Karen's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then, before I could react, she reached down and touched his hair. It was meant to look casual, playful, almost affectionate, but it wasn't because her fingers lingered too long. She took a small lock between her fingers, rolling it as if inspecting it, testing it. Then she gave it a sharp tug, not enough to hurt, but enough to startle him, enough to make Oliver stiffen. He looked up at her then, his hands gripping his hair tighter, shielding it instinctively. Karen laughed a soft chuckle, but there was nothing warm about it. One day, you'll thank me. Then she let go and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement, the sound sharp and final. Oliver's shoulders were still tense. He looked down at his hand, at the strands of hair he was gripping like a lifeline. And for the first time, he asked, Dad, do you think she's going to do something? I should have seen it then. I should have known. Because in that moment, Karen wasn't just annoyed by his hair anymore, she was fixated on it. And the next time she reached for it, she wouldn't stop at a tug. The day Karen finally snapped, it was a warm afternoon. The kind of day that should have been filled with laughter and freedom. Oliver had been outside, playing soccer with his friends. Just a group of 14-year-old boys running, joking, kicking a ball around. For once, he wasn't focused on his hair, his anxiety, or the stares he sometimes got from strangers. For once, he was just a kid having fun. And then, she appeared. She walked over like she owned the place. Her usual tight-lipped smile stretched too wide, too forced. The boys didn't notice her at first. They were too caught up in the game, the sneakers kicking up dust as the ball skidded across the pavement. But Karen wasn't here to watch. She was here to remind them who was in charge. She stepped forward, hands on her hips. Boys, she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness, you shouldn't be playing in the street. It's dangerous. One of Oliver's friends? Jake glanced at her and shrugged. We're not in the street. Karen's nostrils flared. Well, you're making a mess. And you? She turned her gaze to Oliver, her eyes locking onto his hair with that familiar disgust. Still have gotten rid of that mop, huh? The boys paused. A few of them snickered, not at Oliver, her. They had all seen how obsessed she was with his hair, how she treated it like it was some kind of crime against the neighborhood. Oliver just blinked at her, and then he turned back to the game casually, like she wasn't worth his time. That was it. That was the moment Karen snapped. Karen's face twisted, the fake smile gone, the pleasant voice gone. She snatched the soccer ball off the ground and held it tight against her chest. You kids have no respect, she hissed. Jake scoffed. Lady, give the ball back. Karen ignored him. Her entire focus was on Oliver, on his hair swaying gently in the breeze, on the way he had just dismissed her like she was nothing. Something inside her boiled over. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Her breaths came short and fast. Enough. Enough of this. Enough of being ignored before the boys could react. She stormed off toward her house, her movements jerky, uncontrolled. They thought she was just throwing a tantrum. They didn't realize she was coming back with something sharp. Oliver was laughing with his friends, shaking his head as they joked about Karen losing her mind over a soccer ball. Then she was back, scissors in hand. Her grip on them was tight, knuckles white. Before anyone could move, Karen walked straight toward Oliver with determined and steady movements, her breath coming fast, like she had worked herself into a frenzy. The boys saw her coming. What the hell? Jake muttered, stepping back. But Karen wasn't interested in them. She only had eyes for Oliver. And before anyone could react, before Oliver could even process what was happening, she lunged and grabbed a fistful of Oliver's hair, yanking his head back so hard that he stumbled. Oliver let out a sharp cry, his hands immediately flying up to grab her wrist. No, stop. But Karen didn't stop. She wrenched his head to the side, the scissors flashing in the sunlight, and then cut. A chunk of his beautiful long hair fell to the ground. For a second, everything stopped. The boys just stood there, frozen. Oliver knew something was wrong. The second Karen grabbed his hair, her fingers dug into his scalp, twisting into the long strands like hooks sinking into flesh. He tried to pull away, but her grip was ironclad. She was stronger than he expected, her knuckles white with effort, her breathing heavy, ragged, like she had been waiting for this moment. No, stop, Oliver cried, his hands flying up, grabbing at her wrist, trying to pry her off. But she held tight. Then the metallic snap of the scissors. Oliver's entire body locked up. The sound was louder than anything else, louder than the boy shouting, louder than the pounding of his own heartbeat, louder than the choked sob that barely escaped his throat. And then the weight changed. He felt it before he saw it. The familiar heavy of his hair, the way it always brushed against his skin, tickled his neck, softened. The world around him gone. Just like that, a chunk of his hair fell to the ground. His breath hitched, trapped somewhere between a sob and a scream. Karen jerked his head back further, making him gasp. Another snap of the scissors. More strands tumbled like dead leaves in the wind, scattering around his feet. He fought harder, his hands grabbed, gasping at the remaining strands, trying to shield them, to protect what was left. But she was faster. Snip, snip, snip. The blades flashed in the sunlight, ruthless and cold. As more of him disappeared with each cut, the world blurred. Tears burned in his eyes, but he couldn't blink. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He was trapped in her grasp, in this nightmare, in the horror of watching pieces of himself rain down around him. And then as the reality of what was happening sank in, he started to cry. Not just tears, broken, panicked, gasping sobs. Stop, please. But Karen wasn't done. She held onto his hair tightly, her fingers twisted into it like claws. She kept cutting, snip, 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 like she was trimming a hedge, like he wasn't a child, just something messy that needed fixing. Oliver was fighting her now, trying to pull away his hands, scrambling to protect what was left of his hair. Oliver screamed. He tried to run, but she held him still as she hacked away at the hair he loved so much. "Stop," he cried, his voice cracking. "Stop it." But she didn't stop. For a second, the world seemed stuck in slow motion. Karen stood there, a wild look in her eyes, still clutching severed strands of Oliver's hair. Oliver was shaking, hands pressed to his butchered hair, sobbing so hard he could barely breathe. And then his friends moved all at once. Jake was the first to lunge at Karen, shoving her back with all his weight. "What is wrong with you?" he roared. Another boy. Ryan grabbed Karen's arm, trying to pry her fingers off Oliver. Karen stumbled and raged. "Get off me," she shrieked, swinging her arms wildly, still gripping the scissors. But the boys weren't letting up. They shoved her back, tearing Oliver free from her grasp. One of the boys even kicked the scissors out of her hand, sending them clattering across the pavement. By the time Karen finally let go, Oliver's legs buckled. Oliver fell to his knees, still sobbing. The ground was littered with severed strands of his hair. His hands flew to his head, frantic, desperate. His fingers met jagged, uneven patches. Nothing like what had been there before. Nothing like him. A sob broke free. Shattered, shaking, humiliated. Oliver's hands trembled as he picked up a chunk of his own hair, his breath coming in quick, painful gasps. She cut my hair off," he choked out. For a moment, there was only silence. The boys just stood there, frozen. Jake's mouth was open, but no words came out. Ryan looked sick, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his chest heaving like he was about to be sick. Another boy, Liam, took a shaky step forward, then stopped, his eyes darting between Oliver and the strands of hair scattered across the pavement. Nobody moved. The boys didn't know what to do. Jake was the first to react. He dropped to his knees beside Oliver, hands shaking, and started picking up the strands of Oliver's hair. Like maybe somehow he could put it back. Like maybe this wasn't permanent. Like maybe this wasn't real. "Oh my God," Ryan whispered, stepping forward, his hands hovering near Oliver's shoulders, like he wanted to help, but didn't know how. Jake swallowed hard. "Oliver, are you okay?" Oliver wasn't okay. He didn't even answer. He was still on his knees, still shaking, still trying to process what had just been taken from him. His hands kept running over his scalp, feeling the uneven patches, the jagged, hacked-off remains of what had once been his security. Karen was smiling as she stepped back, admiring her work. "There, now, you look like a proper boy." The words barely registered over the sound of the boy shouting over the rush of blood pounding in Oliver's ears. Ryan clenched his jaw so hard it looked painful. Jake fisted his hands, looking toward Karen, his entire body shaking with anger. "You psycho," he breathed. "What is wrong with you?" Karen just smirked. "I did him a favor," she said smoothly. Jake took a step forward like he was about to do something violent. Ryan caught his arm. "Not here." They all looked around. The neighbors had gathered now. Karen was still smiling. She slowly knelt down, her movements calm, deliberate. Mocking with a delicate touch, she picked up a chunk of Oliver's severed hair from the pavement, rolled it between her fingers, studied it. Then she let it fall, let it slip through her fingers like dust, like it was nothing. She exhaled dramatically, like she had just finished a hard day's work, and then turned to the boys. Their faces were filled with rage, disgust, shock. "Good." Karen tilted her head, smirking. "See? Doesn't he look better?" The words landed like a slap. Oliver let out a shaky breath, his arms wrapping around himself like he was trying to disappear. Jake's fists twitched at his sides. Ryan took a sharp step forward, his voice low, deadly. "You're sick." Karen just laughed like she had just told a joke. Then without another word, as if nothing had happened, Karen turned and walked away as if it was over, as if she had won. But she had no idea. This was only the beginning. The moment that made me sick to my stomach when I heard about it later was that the neighbors had seen everything. People had stepped out onto their porches, opened their doors, peeked through windows when they heard the boys screaming. And yet no one stopped Karen. Except for these young boys. My neighbors had watched Karen assault my son. Watched as she held him down, chopped off something that was his, reduced him to tears in front of his friends, and they did nothing. Some of them looked away, pretending they hadn't seen. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads, but never stepping in, and some just stood there arms crossed, waiting to see what would happen next. Like this was some kind of spectacle. Like my son's pain was just another neighborhood drama they could gossip about later. When the fight was over, when Karen had been shoved back enough times by the boys to finally let go, Oliver did the only thing he could. He ran, didn't say a word, didn't look back. He just ran home, his hands pressed to his head, as if somehow he could fix what had been stolen from him, as if he could undo what she had done. I was in the kitchen with my wife when the door slammed open. At first, I thought something had happened at the park. Then I saw him, and my stomach dropped. His face was streaked with tears, his chest heaved with uneven, broken breaths, and his hair, his beautiful long hair, gone. What was left of it were jagged, uneven patches, a butchered mess of what had once been his comfort, his shield, his security. My vision blurred from pure, unfiltered rage. Something inside me snapped. My fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. My jaw locked, my teeth grinding so hard I swore heard something crack. My wife let out a horrified gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh, my God, what happened? And then Oliver collapsed against me, his body trembling, his sobs shaking both of us. He was struggling to get the words out. Karen, I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the blood rushing like a war drum. But I didn't move, didn't speak, not yet. Because if I spoke now, if I moved now, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop myself. My wife let out a choked sob, her hands still clamped over her mouth, her wide, horrified eyes bouncing between me and Oliver. Had Karen done this? My son's fingers curled into my shirt, gripping me like he was trying to keep from falling apart. She cut it off. The rage that filled me was like nothing I had ever felt before. Karen had spent years terrorizing this neighborhood. She had humiliated so many people. When my son came running home sobbing, with uneven tufts of hair sticking up in every direction, I saw this was personal. I had arrested dangerous criminals in my career, but nothing compared to the fury I felt seeing my son treated like that. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands shaking violently. I knew if I let myself move, if I let myself act on this fury now, it wouldn't end. Well, not for her, not for me, not for Oliver. My breathing came in sharp, harsh exhales as I forced myself to focus, to control it. For him, for my son, because right now, Oliver needed his father. Not a man consumed by revenge. But make no mistake, this wasn't over. I crouched down, gripping his trembling shoulders. Who again did you say did this to you, son? Karen, he stammered. She said I was ugly, that I shouldn't be allowed outside looking like that. I felt my son, who was still holding on to me, shaking, and I couldn't fix it. It couldn't undo what had been done. And that broke something inside me. A deep, slow exhale left my lips. And that's when I knew Karen was about to regret every bad thing she had ever done. She had forcefully taken something that wasn't hers to take, and she thought she could just walk away. She thought she would be protected like always. But this time, as I swallowed the rage that threatened to explode, she had messed with the wrong family. After I had handed my son over to his mom to care for him, I stormed across the street, each step fueled by a rage so consuming, it burned through my veins like fire. I didn't care that it was late, almost 8 p.m. I didn't care that the entire neighborhood was watching. After they heard what happened at the park earlier that evening, I bet they knew this was coming. I didn't care that my hands were still shaking from holding my son as he broke down and sobbed in my arms. Karen was going to answer for what she did. I reached her doorstep and pounded on her door so hard. The stupid decorative wreath actually fell off the door. For a moment there was silence. Then the click of the lock. The door swung open, and there she stood. Karen. She was smirking, like she hadn't just humiliated a boy who had never done anything to her except exist in a way she didn't. approve of, like she hadn't just reduced a child to tears in front of his friends. She leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, looking at me like I was the problem. "Oh, it's you," she sighed, tilting her head. "Here to thank me?" I didn't answer. I didn't trust myself to speak without letting all the anger in my chest explode. Instead, I took a slow step forward. "Step outside now." My voice was cold. Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just hair. It'll grow back." I clenched my fist, my nails digging into my palms so hard they might break the skin. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You assaulted my son, Karen." She rolled her eyes and actually laughed. Laughed? "Oh, please." She waved a disrespectful hand. "It's not like I hurt him, I was helping." That was it. That was all I needed to hear. I reached for my belt. "Karen, whatever your surname is, you're under arrest." Karen's expression froze. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Then she laughed again, but it was weaker now. "Forced? Wait, what? You can't be serious." I pulled out my handcuffs. "You assaulted a minor in public on camera. This is as serious as it gets." Karen's mouth opened and closed, her face turning red as the reality of the situation sank in. "You can't. This is ridiculous. I am Richard's wife, and I'm on the HOA board." I let out a sharp breath, shaking my head. "And I'm the chief of police." Then I snapped the cuffs around her wrists. Karen screeched as I cuffed her. "You can't do this. I have rights. So does my son." I snapped. Karen struggled against the cuffs, her breathing ragged. "This is harassment. This is discrimination." But I wasn't listening anymore, because something was happening. Something Karen never expected. The neighbors had come out. They stood on porches lined the sidewalks, phones held high, filming every second of her downfall. Karen kept struggling against the cuffs, her face flushed red, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was Karen. She was on the HOA board. She was married to mogul Richard. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. Her eyes darted around wildly, looking for someone, anyone, to step in and stop this. She turned to the gathering crowd, her voice high-pitched now, desperate. "Are you people just going to stand there? Do something." Silence. No one moved. No one dared. Because for the first time, Karen Dawson was powerless. Her breathing hitched, her pride crumbled. And then her last pathetic attempt. She jerked her head toward me, her lips curling in a sneer. "You think Richard will let you do this?" She spat. "He'll ruin you. He'll bury you so deep you'll never work in this town again." I tilted my head, calm, unmoved. "Oh, you mean your husband?" I let the words hang there for a second. Then I leaned in slightly, my voice just low enough for only her to hear. "The one who's already agreed to cut you loose." Her whole body stiffened. Her mouth parted slightly, her breath catching. She knew. Somewhere deep down, she had always known. Her face drained of color. Karen had spent years playing the role of the perfect trophy wife. She hosted the charity galas she managed their public image. She kept their social circles clean, polished, and powerful. But underneath it all, she was a liability. And Richard, her husband, he was a businessman first. A ruthless one. The kind of man who saw people as assets or dead weight. And, over time, she was becoming very, very expensive. Dead weight. For years, Richard turned a blind eye to her behavior. Her power trips, her obsessive control over the homeowner association, her endless vendettas. He didn't care. Why would he? She was just playing queen of the neighborhood, ruling over a handful of suburban nobodies. It didn't affect him. Not until it started affecting his reputation and business. During the times, Karen stepped on people's toes. Even the homeowner association covered her up. Karen's name was all over the news. Not as a gracious hostess, not as a respected socialite, not as Mrs. Richard D., but as an abuser, as the homeowner association tyrant who was being accused for years of wrongdoing along with her homeowner association board. And Richard Dawson gradually began not wanting to have an interest in standing next to a sinking ship. Richard Dawson didn't marry problems. He got rid of them. For the first time, Karen Dawson had nothing to say. I straightened, stepping back as I signaled to the officers, "Take her away." Karen let out a strangled noise, something between a gasp and a sob. The officers tightened their grip on her arms, and as they dragged her toward the squad car, the reality finally crashed down on her. Her reign was over. Her husband wasn't coming to save her. Her influence was gone. And as the car door slammed shut behind her, the neighborhood cheered. For years, the neighborhood had feared her. For years, they had bowed to her, stayed silent, looked the other way. But now they cheered. A voice rang out, "It's about time." Then another, "She's finally getting what she deserves." And then applause. Karen's face twisted in horror as she looked at the people she had spent years controlling, manipulating, intimidating. As the squad car drove away, she had ruled this neighborhood through fear. But now, they weren't afraid anymore. And she was finally powerless. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. If Karen thought her nightmare ended with her being hauled off in cuffs, she was dead wrong. Because the moment she was arrested, the Homeowner Association board scrambled like cockroaches. Under a spotlight, they rushed to her defense. They tried to spin the story, desperate to protect one of their own. She was just enforcing neighborhood standards, they argued. This is being blown out of proportion, they insisted. Wrong move. Because they had no idea what I was about to uncover. I had every intention to investigate now all of the claims against Karen and the Homeowner Association. And once I started digging into the past records, I found more than I ever expected. Dozens of buried complaints, reports of harassment, prejudice, even vandalism, all covered up. It wasn't just Karen. This Homeowner Association had been dismissing allegations for years, silencing victims, protecting their own. Single moms pushed out, elderly couples bullied into selling their homes, immigrants targeted with violations that didn't exist, families destroyed. All because this dishonest board thought they were untouchable. Not anymore. I gathered everything, every victim, every statement, every single piece of evidence the Homeowner Association had tried to bury and erase. Then it took them down. Within weeks, everything came crashing down. Karen was officially charged with assault and abuse. The entire Homeowner Association board was investigated and exposed for years of dishonesty. No appeals, no loopholes, no second chances. Karen had assumed that her husband would fix this mess she had gotten herself into, that he'd make it disappear like all the other problems she had caused. But when she called him from the police station, he didn't answer. When her lawyers reached out, silence. And when she finally heard from her husband, it wasn't a promise of support. It wasn't a legal team ready to clean up her mess. It was a divorce attorney. What happened? While under arrest at the station, Karen made it clear she wasn't going quietly. Not her. Not the self-appointed queen of the Homeowner Association. She thrashed against the officers, her face red with rage, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "This is illegal," she screeched. "I'll have every single one of you sued into oblivion." No one reacted. No one even flinched. The officers kept working. Karen jerked her head toward me, eyes blazing. "You think this is over? You think you've won, Richard? We'll fix this. He'll have you fired. He'll make sure your family regrets this." I just stared at her, calm, unmoved. And then I stepped aside so she could see who was standing behind me. A man in a dark suit, leather, briefcase, cold expression. Karen's entire body stiffened. She recognized him. Richard's lawyer. The same one who had cleaned up her messes before. Only this time he wasn't here to help her. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Mrs. Karen, your husband has formally filed for divorce, effective immediately." Silence. Karen's mouth opened, closed, opened again. For the first time she had nothing to say. She looked around wildly, desperately, but there was no one left. "One last pathetic attempt," she said. To the lawyer. "No, wait." Her voice was small now, weak. Her husband, Richard, wanted a clean break before she could take him down with her. Because to Richard, Karen wasn't his wife. She was a sinking ship. And Richard, he didn't go down with ships. For the first time in her life, Karen was completely and utterly alone. She had spent years building her world on fear, control, and intimidation. And now she had nothing. Her influence was gone. Her reputation was in shreds. Her husband had abandoned her. Just like that, Karen was gone. The homeowner association wasn't spared as they were forced to disband. My neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The reign of psycho homeowner association, Karen and the homeowner association way was over. For the first time in years, people walked their streets without fear. No more petty fines, no more threats, no more homeowner association board playing God over who was allowed to live in their community. Justice had finally been served, and as for Karen, well, she learned the hard way that power doesn't make you invincible. Not when you mess with the wrong family. As for my son, I made him a promise that night. A promise that no one would ever make him feel powerless again. That Karen didn't win that. He was stronger than what she did to him. And I made sure he knew it. The very next day after the incident with Karen, my wife and I took Oliver to the best hairstylist in the city. The stylist, a friendly guy with an easy smile, couldn't undo what Karen had done. He couldn't bring back the comfort of my boy running his fingers through his long hair, but he could give him control back. For the first time since that awful day, Oliver got to make the decision about his own hair. And that was everything. The stylist treated him like royalty. He let him pick the cut. He let him choose a bold design to cut into his hair that he could watch disappear as his hair grew back. My boy chose a lightning bolt. Something fierce. Something strong. A reminder that he wasn't broken. That he was still him. The stylist grinned at Oliver in the mirror. "You're going to look sharp, kid. And don't worry, hair always grows back. But confidence? That's forever." And when the stylist turned the chair around to reveal the final look, for the first time since that awful day, Oliver smiled. Not because his hair was exactly the way it was before, but because he knew no one would ever take that choice away from him again. The day after his haircut, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Jake, Ryan, and the rest of Oliver's friends standing there, hands in their pockets, kicking at the ground. Teenage boys weren't always the best at emotional moments, but they were here, and that meant everything. I called Oliver over, and when he stepped into view, his fresh cut on display, the boy faces lit up. Jake let out a low whistle. "Dude, Ollie, your hair is awesome." Ryan grinned. "Way cooler than before. You actually look kind of tough now." Other kid elbowed Oliver playfully. "Like a warrior or something." Oliver hesitated for a second. Then he smiled. Not forced, not small. A real, genuine weight lifted off his shoulders. Kind of smile. "Thanks," he muttered, running a hand over the sharp design shaved into his hair. "I think so too." The boys didn't push the moment. They just nodded. Like that was that. Like nothing had changed. Then Jake smirked. "Come on, we need a rematch." No way. Karen's going to ruin our next game." Oliver laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in days. And just like that, the weight of what happened started to lift. Karen had tried to humiliate my son. She had tried to strip him of his dignity, but she had failed because Oliver wasn't alone, and he never would be. If the story made you think, even for a second, then share it. Because standing up for what's right starts with awareness. If you believe in justice and standing up for what's right, and want to continue to see more stories like this, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel. Every day we share captivating Karen Homeowner Association stories you won't want to miss. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.